In this, the 33rd lesson in the course, A Critical History of Economic Theory and Policy, we explore the forces that drove the economy of Japan following the end of the Second World War, and that eventually resulted in a dramatic contraction at the end of the 1980s that continues to plague the Japanese people. The Japanese people united after 1945 to rebuild on the foundation of a new liberal and democratic government and a modernized export-driven economy. They were prepared to sacrifice a good deal for the good of the nation. As head of the Occupation Administration, General Douglas MacArthur orchestrated a significant reinvention of Japanese society. His first act was to establish a nationwide food distribution network, preventing mass starvation and gaining the cooperation of the Japanese people. Japan to this point was dominated by a privileged rentier class of landlords. To broaden the ownership of land, a program of land distribution was crafted by Hiro Wada, former Japanese Minister of Agriculture, and supported by MacArthur. Between 1947 and 1949, approximately 5,800,000 acres of land, approximately 38% of Japan's cultivated land, were purchased from the landlords under the government's reform program and resold at extremely low prices to the farmers who worked them, subject to tight restrictions on resale and to sustained cultivation requirements. By 1950, 3 million peasants had acquired land. Unfortunately, nothing was done to see that the rental value of the land was collected annually via taxation. The framework was set for an eventual climb in land prices as Japan's population and individual incomes increased. Land that eventually had a much higher best use than growing crops remained underutilized as the Japanese sought to become self-sufficient in food production. A 1999 World Bank paper by Toshihiko Kawagoe raises this important question. Land reform in Japan after World War II has long been considered one of the most successful agrarian reform projects in the world. But does empirical research support this reputation? Or was land reform only a political success? In the short run, this land reform program removed the power of the rentier class in favor of actual farmers. Over time, however, land that was cultivated for food production came to have a far higher best use as the Japanese population grew, and with it, the size of Japanese cities. Over 200 Japanese cities were bombed heavily during the Second World War. As most buildings were of wood, bombing produced vast destruction, turning these cities into even more of a blank slate than bombed European cities. As in Europe, Japanese reconstruction was surprisingly rapid, but it took on distinctly Japanese forms. Town planning was, with few exceptions, highly centralized, and planners relied more on land readjustment schemes and road planning than on dramatic land use changes. As this photograph of Hiroshima indicates, a new city arose over several decades. In most cases, the character of the rebuilt cities was determined more by private builders than public projects. In most cities, dense neighborhoods reappeared. Nothing could stop the migration of the Japanese people from the many rural villages to Tokyo, where opportunities for a better life seemed available. Even as the Japanese population began to level off and begin to decline, Tokyo continued to grow. By the end of 2011, the population of Tokyo was estimated to be 13.2 million, or about 10% of Japan's total population. With a population density of more than 6,000 persons per square kilometer, Tokyo is the most densely populated prefecture in Japan. Japanese cities are connected by an extensive railway system. Within the cities, each Japanese neighborhood is named for its train station, and each station is within a 30-minute walk from one another. Here is the subway map of Tokyo. In most cities, homes and apartments are spread like spiral staircases around each train station. Straight roads are reserved for commerce. In a very real sense, the great devastation of Japan's infrastructure and many of its industrial centers during the Second World War enabled Japanese planners to redesign the nation from scratch. However, for all that they got right, they failed to recognize the fundamental flaws in the nation's system of land tenure and taxation. As Japanese businesses converted from military production, consumers in the United States provided a huge market for Japanese exports. Moreover, as the Cold War intensified, the United States adopted policies that favored Japanese businesses as a foreign policy strategy. The Japanese also benefited by a constitutional restriction against military rearmament. Japan was able to rebuild protected from external threats by the U.S. military. Japanese businesses, the government, and workers forged a societal compact that guaranteed to firms access to government-supported credit, to many workers lifetime employment, and as the economy expanded, Japanese households saved a higher and higher portion of their income, forced to do so in part by the absence of a program of Social Security benefits. The Japanese government protected domestic producers by imposing high tariffs on imported goods and permitting the formation of producer cartels that enabled Japanese companies to gain market share by offering low-priced goods in foreign markets while enjoying high profit margins on domestic sales. By the early 1960s, nearly one-third of economic development in Japan was funded by private savings in the banks. By 1970, the savings rate of Japanese households reached 20% and peaked in 1974 through 1976. The Japanese form of capitalism embraced the Keynesian strategy of demand management in service to production for export. The Ministry of Finance encouraged the rationalization of firms and industries and guided the structural transformation of the economy. The Ministry of International Trade and Industry stimulated the movement of capital goods production and labor out of declining industries such as coal and textiles and into promising new industries with high growth potential, first into electronics, steel, petrochemicals, and automobiles, and later into computers, semiconductors, and biotechnology. The Japanese miracle was underway. Throughout the 1970s, Japan's economy in size was second only to the United States. After a mild slump in the mid-1980s, the economy boomed again, and in 1990 it ranked first among the major industrial powers in per capita GDP. Credit was easily available and interest rates low. The Nikkei stock index doubled and then doubled again. Not appreciated by the government or economists was that the Japanese economy was now being driven less by manufacturing profits than by financial transactions. Bubbles in stocks, land, and real estate were building, as credit was easily available, interest rates were low, and borrowing massive. Investors decided to take their profits and move into less risky investments. From its height in January 1990, the Nikkei that month plunged. By July 1992, the Nikkei was down around 16,000 a 57% fall. Japanese banks sought to recover losses by making even riskier loans, as creditworthy borrowers became more scarce. One bank after another was overwhelmed by defaulting borrowers and climbing loan losses. The Japanese government responded to the recessionary downturn by expanding spending on infrastructure, bridges, airports, and roads. The 1995 Kobe earthquake, which killed thousands, stimulated more spending, but unemployment continued to hover around 5% officially, unofficially probably at least 10%. The banking crisis intensified, and in late 1997, numerous banks failed. Japanese corporations, always dependent on access to cheap credit, were now weighted down with massive debt, but could neither refinance easily or obtain new loans for capital investment. The exchange rate between the Japanese yen and the US dollar was at 159 to $1 at the beginning of April 1990. By the end of 1994, the rate had fallen to 100 yen to $1. The Japanese government injected 1.8 trillion yen into Japan's main banks to keep them afloat. Many banks were found to be underreporting the extent of their real losses, and a full-blown government bailout was required in 1999. After a period of bank consolidations, Japan was left with just 4 national banks. William Tabb, professor of economics at Queens College at the City University of New York, summarized the state of affairs the Japanese had fallen into. He wrote, "The mergers won't make their job any easier. For example, there is no plan for any of the 3 present heads of the Industrial Bank of Japan, Fuji, or Daiichi Kangyo to step aside, nor has the huge amount of taxpayer money solved many problems." The Japanese government used $180 billion of the funds it laid out during the current round of bailouts to buy preferred stock in the banks. The banks then used the money to buy government securities. The securities pay the banks more than the bank pays the holders of the preferred stock, including the government. Little of the government money flowing to the banks then makes its way into the rest of the economy, and so does little to spur growth. Not unexpectedly, as recession deepened and tax revenue declined, Japan's government debt began to escalate. As the property bubble burst in Japan, the nation's economy fell into a deep recession. Stock values also declined until the beginning of the current decade. A key question for investors is whether Japanese stocks are heading toward the next asset bubble and when this might occur. What researchers have discovered is that many Japanese companies diverted profits into property acquisitions and the development of shopping centers, resorts, and hotels rather than in modernization and technology upgrades. Speculation pushed Japanese land and securities to astronomical levels, pushing Japanese firms offshore in an effort to protect profit margins. As this chart indicates, the process has actually accelerated since the 2008 crash of the global financial and economic markets. At the height of the property market cycle, the nominal value of all of the property in Japan was estimated to have a market value 5 times that of all property across the United States. In October 1988, the Japanese National Land Agency estimated that the land in central Tokyo around the Midea Building, a retail food store, would cost a buyer $248,000 a square foot. The grounds of the Imperial Palace in downtown Tokyo was said to be worth all the land in California. Australia sold part of the land its embassy was on and paid off half of its foreign debt. With the declining value of land factored in, asset values fell by around $10 trillion. The price of many properties dropped by 70% between 1990 and 2000. And even in Japan, what did the Japanese economists have to say about the property market collapse? The reaction of the Japanese Ministry of Finance was predictable. They equated the fall in stock and land prices with economic disaster and adopted measures to prop up asset prices as best as possible. State-controlled funds invested in the national pension, postal saving, and postal life insurance schemes were called upon to purchase stocks and properties. By the mid-1990s, the Japanese government had acquired about 2% of all of Japan's quoted shares of stock, providing more than half of all loans made to corporations, and served as the only net buyer of real estate. In 1998, economist Alan Reynolds analyzed the Japanese economic collapse and commented on the policy measures adopted respecting land. Reynolds wrote, "The 1992 land tax is another new tax on capital, but one designed, as explained by Ishii, as an attempt to seek an effective policy with respect to reducing land prices. Unfortunately, the Bank of Japan had the same goal. If inflicting windfall losses on landowners is a legitimate policy objective, then these policies were extremely effective. Land had been a very important asset behind Japan's stocks. So deflating land prices deflated stock prices too. Land and stock were collateral behind many loans. So the goal of reducing land prices continues to have unpleasant repercussions on banks and credit. The actual problem is that capital gains taxes on land sales can be extremely high, while property taxes on land ownership are very low, particularly for farms. The net effect is a powerful lock-in effect that discourages property sales and discourages efficient use of a valuable resource. Capital gains on land transactions should surely not be taxed at a higher rate than gains on financial claims to land, which is largely what many corporate stocks represent. Also, higher capital gains tax rates on assets held for short periods do not make economic sense for any asset, except perhaps as a very crude way of indexing for inflation. In short, the capital gains tax on land is far too high, and the new land tax is much less efficient than raising the broader property tax. We in the United States learned nothing from what was occurring in Japan. Few economists, and not even Alan Reynolds, grasped that land markets in the United States were similarly overheating because of the potential for speculation-driven profits. How the Japanese government responded to the nation's dysfunctional property markets was piecemeal. New annual property taxes were imposed based on a standardized assessment of the property, with a separate assessment on the land parcel and whatever structure is present. So far, so good. A fixed asset tax of 1.4% and a municipal tax of 0.3% of assessed value is levied. The rates were set by the central government but collected locally. Local governments retain half of the tax revenue collected. An additional property tax may be charged in areas designated as an urban zone, that is, an area where building codes result in structures able to better withstand earthquakes, fires, or other threats. The impact of recession on household and business incomes has resulted in a high rate of property tax delinquency. Over 7% of all property owners nationwide did not pay the taxes owed in 2009.